The application of the Four Noble Truths to abandon the five hindrances or lower fetter by Venerable Rungruan Pa Patsaro, Dr. Rungruan Limchu Patapa. In Buddhist meditation, the unwholesome hindrance is not forcibly subdued by meditation power, but instead it is abandoned by having mindfulness with attention on opposite reality of the right perception. And later in an insight observation, when experiencing the reality with wisdom, by then this wisdom is developed and then it will use to subdue all the arising unwholesome ones with wisdom. In the four mindfulness foundations, we will learn the truths of the appearing to be a beauty by performing an unattractiveness of the body and the 9 charnel ground contemplations to gain wisdom of the reality of the sensual pleasure in beauty body, and later using this wisdom to counter-attack the arising sensual pleasure within the mind processing. The application of the Four Noble Truths to abandon the 5 hindrances or lower fetter is performed as follows. The problem statement and the root cause analysis. There are 5 types of hindrance or lower fetter of the middle defilements arising during the courses of thought, including 1. Desire for sensual pleasure is a kind of middle defilement of an unwholesome thinking with desire for sensual pleasure. It is originated when receiving a pleasant stimulus from the world through the 6 sense bases, then the mind feels happy with pleasure. Dependently on happy feeling, then the craving for sensual pleasure arises. After then the mind mistakenly assumes a self for desire and lust for sensual pleasure. That is, a self with desire to keep the sensual pleasure forever, and it is the lust of demanding for my sensual pleasure. Then the mind attaches to the assumption of a self struggling to the 5 aggregates subject to clinging with ignorance. And after processing in several rounds of the process of dependent origination, the mind is fully formulated and contaminated into a middle defilement of desire for sensual hindrance within the mind processing, and eventually it will be complicated to be greedy for something in the rough defilement. 2. Ill will is a kind of middle defilement of an unwholesome thinking with desire for extermination. It is originated when receiving an unpleasant stimulus from the world through the 6 sense bases, then the mind feels unhappy with pain. Dependently on painful feeling, then the craving for extermination arises. After then the mind mistakenly assumes a self for desire and lust for extermination. That is, a self with desire to expel the pain immediately, and it is the lust for extermination, the pain by force. Then the mind attaches to the assumption of a self struggling to the 5 aggregates subject to clinging with ignorance. And after processing in several rounds of the process of dependent origination, the mind is fully formulated and contaminated into a middle defilement of ill will within the mind processing, and eventually it will be complicated to be hatred on something in the rough defilement. 3. Torpor or depression is a kind of middle defilement of unwholesome thinking of some unfavorable experiences in the past. The mind is struggling with repeated old experiences. It is originated from the ignorance of not knowing the truths of life correctly. As a matter of fact, what happened in the past has already gone, and it is the mind that keeps on generating a new mental object of the similar phenomenon with volitional formations. This is sort of a self-illusion of bad experience in the past. And eventually this problem hurts the mind to suffer with torpor, and depression of middle defilement. 4. Restlessness or anxiety is a kind of middle defilement of unwholesome worry of what may happen in the future. The mind is struggling with fear. It is originated from the ignorance of not knowing the truths of life correctly. As a matter of fact, what worrying about does not happen yet in the future. This is sort of a self-illusion of something bad to happen in the future. And eventually this problem hurts the mind to become restlessness, and anxiety of middle defilements. 5. Uncertainty or doubt is a kind of middle defilement of unwholesome wondering of not knowing what it is happening. It is originated from the ignorance of not knowing the truths of life in the first round of the process of dependent origination. After then the mind is driven by confusion of not knowing what to, and the mind will keep on generating a new mental object with volitional formations before developing to become the uncertainty, and the doubt of middle defilements, and eventually it will be complicated to be a delusion within the rough defilement. The objectives: 1. Learning on how to explore various problems within the mind. 2. Learning on how to have a mindfulness to study the nature of the arising problem. 3. Learning on how to have a mindfulness with careful attention to bring an appropriated perception or thinking to cope with an arising problem. 4. Completing the tasks on abandoning all the 5 hindrances within the mind. Then to master the courses of thought. The goal in this part of practice is to abandon any arising hindrance, so that the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. And by having mindfulness to explore the mind on the arising of 5 hindrances, then realizing that these mental phenomena of the 5 hindrances as impermanent, as suffering, as a disease, as a tumor, as a barb, as a calamity, as an affliction, as alien, as disintegrating, as void, as no self, then the mind will abandon of the 5 lower fetters, hindrances, as follows.
Whatever exists therein of feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, he sees those states as impermanent, as suffering, as a disease, as a tumor, as a barb, as a calamity, as an affliction, as alien, as disintegrating, as void, as no self. He turns his mind away from those states and directs it toward the deathless element thus. This is the peaceful, this is the sublime, that is, the stilling of all formations, the relinquishing of all acquisitions, the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. If he is steady in that, he attains the destruction of the taints. But if he does not attain the destruction of the taints, then through that very desire for the Dharma, that delight in the Dharma, with the destruction of the 5 lower fetters he becomes one due to be reborn spontaneously, in the pure abodes, and there attain final nibbana without ever returning from that world. This is the path and way to the abandoning of the 5 lower fetters, hindrances.
In Buddhism, the destruction of the 5 hindrance or the lower fetters is a critical path of the Buddhist practice, and the technique of having mindfulness with attention on wholesome to take the mind away from unwholesome state of mind is the most common tactics in handling any arising troubling state of mind, because naturally every phenomenon within the mind will arise, then fading away, and ceasing. Therefore, if we realize this truth, then no matter of what phenomenon it is impermanent, deteriorating, and no self in nature anyway, then the mind will be directed toward the right pathway by wisdom. In addition, the Buddha suggested a proper technique in handling a particular arising hindrance or lower fetter in details. The corrective action plan to abandon on each particular type of the 5 hindrances, during performing the Buddhist practice with mindfulness. Each type of the 5 hindrances or lower fetters will occasionally arise one by one as follows. 1. The corrective actions taken to abandon the desire for sensual pleasure. Among all the 5 hindrances, the desire and lust for sensual pleasure are the most troublesome because it involves with the basic instinct of being. Typically, sensual pleasure will make people happy, and since everyone wants to have a happy life, so everyone has a desire for sensual pleasure. However, the world is not easy as we expect, and if we may achieve some, but the mind will drive for more, saying craving for sensual pleasure has no limitation. Whatsoever we get, it will never fulfill the demand. So, no matter how much we may try to be satisfied, but eventually the mind will be dissatisfied, and unavoidably the mind will sink into suffering anyway. So why not abandoning the desire for sensual pleasure right now, so that the mind will not be struggle with this kind of never-ending demand for sensual pleasure? In performing a Buddhist practice, we need the mind to become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. Therefore we have to abandon the desire for sensual pleasure. The Buddha compared the sensual pleasure like fruits on a tree that provide more suffering than benefit as follows.
A noble disciple considers thus: sensual pleasures have been compared like fruits hanging on a tree. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is still more. Having seen this thus as it really is with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified, based on diversity, and develops the equanimity that is unified, based on unity, where clinging on the carnal things of the world utterly ceases without remainder.
In this situation of having a sensual pleasure, the Buddha suggested to understand the disadvantages and harms of the desire for sensual pleasure, because it will burn the mind, making the mind to struggle with desire and lust, which lead to greed and delusion. The subject of the hindrance of desire for sensual pleasure is very challenging, since the Buddha, who was a prince who had also enjoyed the unlimited number of sensual pleasures and beauties before, when once he woke up at night after a party and saw all the people scattered around in different postures, he realized that all of these activities were meaningless nonsense, so he decided to leave these sensual pleasures and comforts as follows.
Before the enlightenment, when I, the Buddha, perform the mindfulness meditation, what the most troublesome annoying the mind is the sensual pleasure, although there is no such desire at the present and the future, but still the mind thinks of the sensual pleasure of the past. I suggest to you that you must have a mindfulness at all times, and the mindfulness will protect the mind from any sensual pleasures to arise within the mind.
In another occasion, a cousin of the Buddha, who became a monk on the day of his wedding, had a problem with sensual desire because of thinking of the beautiful girl who he was going to marry with, and this kind of feeling disturbed his practice very much. The Buddhas guided him about how to abandon the sensual feeling by having mindfulness, trying to contain a sensual pleasure by having mindfulness with the faculties of 6 sense bases as follows. Realizing that the desire and lust for sensual pleasure has never been fulfilled. It is a never-ending quest for satisfaction, which contradicts to the reality in nature that whatsoever that arises will fade away and eventually ceases. And if we still cling on the arising sensual pleasure, then this conflicting situation will unavoidably end up causing suffering in life. Understanding that life is impermanent. The happy feeling is a natural phenomenon that will arise and cease by nature. All those sensual pleasures related to beauties are impermanent as well. As time passes by, then everyone must get old, and what the beauty that we desire for is. Aging is a part of natural process. No one can prolong it forever. Having a perception of a dead body. It is a worst-case scenario that everyone must die anyway, no one can run away from dead. By then that desire and lust for beauty and frame will turn out to be a cadaver. And no one wants the cadaver anymore. This is a fact of life. It should be understood that sensual pleasure itself is not a problem, but the problem is craving for sensual pleasure with desire and lust that drives the mind to struggle and demand for more, from which most of wrong actions with greed and suffering are rooted. It is very essential to realize of the harm of craving for sensual pleasures by containing it within a limitation, and then abandoning it with proper corrective realization. When receiving a strong stimulus from the world, especially the kind of sexual attraction, it is not easy to divert an attention from it, and mostly the mind will be deeply involved with the world. In this circumstance, we have to have a mindfulness with an attention to be something opposite from the attraction to the stimulus by having a proper contradicting perception to manage to subdue any arising emotional feeling, and in Buddhism this is a way to be a master of the courses of thought within the mind, that is, being able to have a continuation of mindfulness with careful attention on what is happening along the course of thinking, then being able to divert the path of thinking into another direction. In this circumstance, the knowledge of the 10 perceptions is very useful because practitioner can select an appropriate type of perception to cope with the receiving stimulus rightly, For examples, the perception on loathsomeness and the perception on the disadvantage of body are the classic perceptions to counter with the feeling of sensual pleasure with desire and lust to the world. Having a perception on impermanency, and having a perception on no self or impersonality are very effective in handle a delusion. Having a perception on the non-delightfulness of the whole world, and having a perception on the non-pleasantness of the whole world will counter the excitement of the stimulus from the world. 2. Corrective actions taken to abandon the ill will. When encountering with something bad or irritating, it is very common that we will try to identify the one who causes it, and wanting to take revenge on the person. The ill will aggravate the problem to be more serious, turning to be hatred, and eventually leading to take an avenging to the particular person. This hurting each other feeling is a never-ending problem. Therefore, the ill will is not the right way to resolve the conflicting problem, but compromising, and forgiveness are the right ways to end the problem. Therefore, if starting to have an ill will, then we should try to abandon it before it will be increasingly aggravated into a serious problem. In the circumstance when having an ill will, the Buddha suggested to be kind to others, and if possible, we should forgive of whatsoever a person had done in the past. This may sound strange because most people want to punish or to kick back to the person for what bad thing he has done in the past. However, in Buddhism under the law of karma, whatsoever the person has done, he will get it back by the nature. There is no need for anyone to take a revenge for oneself. But by having an ill will within a mind processing, it will jerk the mind from being steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. Therefore, we have to abandon the unwholesome ill will, and do not let the ill will to bother the practice. In Buddhism, the greatest charity of all kinds is the forgiveness.
The Buddha suggested that when feeling any ill will to a person, there were 5 ways to abandon the arising ill will as follows. Having a loving kindness to that person, so-called performing a loving kindness meditation. Having a compassion to that person, so-called performing a compassion meditation. Having a neutrality to that person, so-called performing a neutrality meditation. Understanding that person does it without mindfulness. Ignoring of what he, she had done, and let the law of karma to take care of it. It is not our business to judge or to be involved with that person.
It should be reminded that the compassion meditation is a derivative of the mindfulness meditation, that is, to have a mindfulness with careful attention on compassion to hold the mind in concentration. So does the loving kindness meditation is to have a mindfulness with careful attention on loving kindness, and the neutrality meditation is to have a mindfulness with careful attention on neutrality, respectively. By having a skillful experience of mindfulness meditation, then we can apply to various kinds of wholesome states of mind in performing the Buddhist meditation. It is very common that everyone would like happiness and dislike unhappiness, love and hate happen in everyday life, but by having a craving for sensual pleasure or a craving for extermination with desire and lust will make the mind to struggle during the practice. 3. Corrective actions taken to abandon the depression. Depression arises when thinking of something negative or unsolvable problem that happened in the past. These negative thinking makes the mind to feel depressed and bored with whatever is happening around us. However, since the mind cannot pull out of it, so this depressing story still sinks into deeper and deeper concerned. This seems to be a mentally self-punishment of an individual by adding more suffering into life. As a matter of fact, we should not waste our time on depression, but instead we should resolve the problem, and to recover from this bad situation as soon as possible. In the case of depression problem, the Buddha suggested to shift the mind, so that the mind will have something more interesting to do. This technique is called the way to manage to suppress the current unwholesome thought with some wholesome activity to do. The Buddha suggested several corrective activities as follows. Washing up the face with fresh water, making yourself cheerful. It should be added here that talking with friends, taking some exercise like jogging, do not be lonely because it makes you feel lonesomeness, are recommended as well. Performing a mindfulness breathing, by having a mindfulness in breathing in, and a mindfulness breathing out at all times. The focus of mind will be shifted from depressive matter to breathing. And not only a mindfulness is developed, but also the depression is abandoned from the mind. Having a mindfulness listening to the Dharma, or reading the Dharma, or discoursing on the Dharma, or thinking of the wholesomeness of Dharma, so that the mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, concentrated. Applying the Four Noble Truths to resolve the problem, once having a mindfulness, reviewing the problem carefully, such as what is the origin and the cause of the problem? What are the benefits and harms of the problem? How we can resolve the problem or just abandon the problem? 4 corrective actions taken to abandon the anxiety. The anxiety is something quite opposite to the depression in terms of timeline. It arises when being worried of something negative or unpredictable problem that may happen in the future. These negative thinking makes the mind to be anxiety of what it will happen to me. In handling with an anxiety, we have to understand the truths of life within nature that, whatsoever will happen, it will happen. Everything in the world is under the law of cause and effect. As long as we do our best by making necessary preparations, and then an outcome will follow as it is by the law of cause and effect. There is nothing to worry about. It should be noticed that both depression and anxiety are caused by our own internal thinking that causes the mind not to be internally steady, composed, united, and centered. That is, the depression is caused by having unwholesome thinking of something in the past, while the anxiety is caused by worrying of what will happen in the future. In both situations, the Buddha suggested to have a mindfulness at the present moment to pull the mind out from the depression of the past and the anxiety of the future as follows.
One should neither run back into what happened in the past, nor be afraid of what will happen in the future. What a depression and an anxiety are about, is just an object of consciousness in the mind. Whatsoever happened is already happened, and it arises and fades away. It is impossible to change the past. Whatsoever to happen in the future is dependently on a certain cause and effect. If do it right, then the outcome will be right as well. Especially at this moment, nothing is happening yet. Whatsoever happening in the mind, it arises and eventually fades away. Those who has mindfulness at the present moment all day and night, will have nothing to be worried about. We should have a mindfulness at the present moment because when the mind has received either a stimulus of external mental phenomenon from sense bases or an internal formulated mental phenomenon, if we do not think of whatsoever happened in the past or of whatsoever will happen in the future, and then the mind will not be bothered with any matter anymore. That is, we should not think of what happened in the past, and do not run forward into the expectation of what will happen in the future, but to firmly keep the mind to stay at the present moment only. Then the mind will not be afraid of anything. And the mind will abandon the 5 aggregates subject to cling.
The Buddhist technique of having mindfulness at the present moment to cope with depression and anxiety receive a lot of attentions in modern psychology therapies, and this technique has proven to be very successful nowadays. The problems of depression and anxiety are very common in the modern society. Nowadays children grow up with pressures to compete with hostile environment of an isolated family. Unavoidably both depression and anxiety are aggravated little by little since we are young. Therefore, teaching mindfulness at school is widely popular in Western education system. 5. The corrective actions taken to abandon the hindrance of doubt and confusion. In Buddhism, if we do not understand on something, then we have any doubt on something, and if there are so many possibilities, but we cannot know which one is correct, then it is a confusion. Both doubt and confusion are rooted from the same thing, this is, an ignorance of not knowing the truths of life within nature, so called the Four Noble Truths. If a person has a strong faith on something, but what he believes is not true, then the person may claim that he has no doubt or confusion, but in reality, he has a doubt and confusion, but he does not know. In Buddhism, it is a learning process on how to apply the Four Noble Truths analysis to investigate and to discover the truths of life within nature. Therefore, if we keep on practicing the application of the Four Noble Truths, then there is nothing to be doubtful, and there is no confusion at all. In the situation if there is any doubt or confusion during performing the Buddhist practice, it is recommended to have a study on the Buddha's teachings carefully. Otherwise, we can apply the Four Noble Truths to the problem directly, and then learning from what it really is directly. The Venerable Sariputta explained about the methodology for the wisdom development in threefold study strategy as follows.
The ignorance, doubt and confusion will be replaced by wisdom, including the knowledge gained from the study on morality, the study on mind, and the study on wisdom. This study consists of the following procedure, that is, first being pleased to hear the Buddha's teachings, then considering an investigation in his teachings, then contemplating in his teachings, then performing practice with effort by having a mindfulness meditation, then having an insight observation to see the nature as it really is, and then finally gaining wisdom for the cessation of all defilements, thus applying this wisdom to liberate all the problems and suffering in life. This is called the way to study in Buddhism.
In Buddhism, the only way to resolve any doubt and confusion is by studying the truths of life within nature to gain wisdom on how to deal with the world rightly. During mindfulness meditation for the cessation of 5 hindrances, we will learn about how to use mindfulness to balance and stabilize the mind to be in neutral zone by abandoning the arising hindrance. The mind will have no doubt knowing how to handle all the situations properly, and by then the neutral mind will penetrate into an absorption of the inner mind. The subject of the cessations of the 5 hindrances, the 5 lower fetters, is very important in Buddhist practice. In performing the Buddhist practice, practitioners should be patient to completely cleanse up all the 5 hindrances before moving forward into an absorption, and then an insight observation, respectively as follows.
The perfectly enlightened one who will first abandon the 5 hindrances, the lower fetters, namely, desire for sensual pleasure, ill will, sloth, depression, anxiety, and doubt, including the rough defilements of the mind, namely, greed, hatred, delusion that weaken wisdom. And after then, his mind will be established in the 4 establishments of mindfulness, then developed correctly to the 7 factors for enlightenment, namely, mindfulness, dharma investigation, effort, rapture, calmness, concentration, equanimity, and thereby he has awakened to unsurpassed perfect enlightenment.
The Buddhist practice is a part of practical learning of the reality of the mind in accord to the threefold study strategy. In the practices on abandoning the 5 hindrances, 5 lower fetters, we will experience and learning many ways to abandon any kinds of arising problems within the mind. By having a good experience in performing the mindfulness meditation, then the mind will develop a kind of stable mind with the right mindfulness and a right concentration, and then even when leaving the meditation practice, and encountering any troubling matter in the world, such as unwholesome images, noisy sounds, annoy smell and taste, irritating touching, etc. through the 6 sense bases, by then a developed mind will be able to handle the arising problem by having a mindfulness with careful attention, determining, on proper considerations to abandon these unwholesome thoughts, and then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated again. By performing the Buddhist practice in accord to the Buddha's teachings, practitioner will slowly absorb the Four Noble Truth analysis into the cognitive process. Practitioners should regularly perform abandoning all the middle defilements at all times, not limited only during the practice, but also even in daily life when having mindfulness, being aware of any arising defilement, then immediately applying a proper perception or thinking to counterattack the problem. After being able to abandon all the 5 hindrances of middle defilements, then the mind will be in very steady state with concentration, and then we can proceed along the course of thought to the initial thought in the mindfulness absorption without much disturbing from troubling thoughts. And this is the reason why it is suggested to abandon all the 5 hindrances first before dwelling into the inner mind of initial thought in mindfulness absorption. The Buddhist practice is a progressive development of the cognitive process of mind in learning on how to handle the varieties of problems within the mind, especially the types of rough defilements and middle defilements in the beginning of the practice. And then after cleansing most of the 5 hindrances out from the mind will get less and less disturbing noises, and the mind will become internally steady, composed, united, and concentrated, and the mind will dwell further into an inner mind in an absorption.